Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Food for Thought webinar, a look at food security on a global basis. I'd like to welcome everyone along tonight, and I suppose to start with, I'd say, like, before this Russian invasion of the Ukraine, the reality is that those 800 million people in the world were already suffering from hunger and food shortage, and the war in the Ukraine has really exacerbated that situation. According to the UN, food security is the measure of an individual's ability to access sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So I think here tonight we want to look at a number of elements of this situation. I suppose if you look at it from a European context, many would say we don't really have a major food security issue in Europe, primarily because of CAP. But if you turn to Ukraine, there's probably 18 million people in Ukraine who will suffer food shortages. And then if you go to developing countries, there's an even bigger issue at that level. So in this webinar this evening, we want to look at the reasons behind the current crisis, the impact it's going to have on consumers and on farmers, and particularly, as I just mentioned, the impact on the world's poorest nations. So anyone who's been on any of our webinars before, you'll know the drill. I keep it to a minimum at the start. We'll have our four panelists who will speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll be opening the floor to the chat for people to put their questions into the chat function, and we'll get to the questions and a discussion with the four panelists afterwards. Our four panelists, the first of which is Minister Colm Brophy, Minister for State, the Irish Government with responsibility for overseas development aid, who will talk to us about the Irish perspective on food security. Then we've Pauline Weil, research analyst at the independent economic think tank Bruegel, who will give us an overview of the global supply picture, as well as issues with supply chains and the economic impacts. Then Natasha Foote, Agri-food and health journalist with EURACTIV, who will look at the European response to the current situation, and also will look at the unique part being played by small farmers in the Ukraine. And finally, we'll have Tom Arnold, who's an agricultural economist and public policy advisor with a background in development aid, who currently is the Irish government's special envoy for food systems and chaired Irish government's 10-year agri-strategy, Food Vision 2030. So without any further ado, I'll go to the first of our speakers, Minister Brophy. I appreciate he's on a tight schedule. Number one, he's taken away from his love of Liverpool football, but equally I know he has an appointment later on as well, so he may not be able to stay with us till the end. But I'll pass it over to you, Minister, to kick off from the Irish perspective.
Thank you very much, Colm. Very much appreciated. Yeah, I must be a bad fan because I not only have this appointment this evening, I have a subsequent one as well. So either that means I'm quite busy or I'm not a good enough fan. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me along to this evening. I think it's a very timely event to be hosting. And, you know, unfortunately, for reasons that are very sad in a way, effectively, we've all seen those daily reports coming out of the Ukraine. It really is a shocking situation that is taking place, an unasked for war in Europe, perpetrated against a country like Ukraine, which has a very proud tradition and will have a huge impact in terms of what we're going to talk about this evening, this particular war. It's important, I think, to put in context that, because it really is important, the impact of the war that on Ukraine will have in terms of food security. In 2021, either Russia or Ukraine ranked among the top 3 global exporters of wheat, of maize, sunflower oil. The Russian Federation is also a top exporter of nitrogen fertilizer. The impact of what's happening now is that, particularly for import-relying development countries, they're therefore incredibly vulnerable to the first part of things, which are price hikes. So regardless of what happens in relation to overall shortages, and I think we are looking at food shortages as well, we will see countries who are very reliant on import and will see very, very substantial, and have already seen substantial price hikes. Very mindful of the fact that these countries have already been facing very protracted food insecurity. For some of them, it's a combination of local conflict. It's several years of climate-driven drought. which has impacted these countries. If you take the Sahel region, the Horn of Africa, these are particular areas of concern. We have an emerging huge area of concern in Afghanistan. Now, the World Food Programme, which is a strategic partner for Ireland, it sources 50% of all its grain from Ukraine. So if you just pause for a second just to think about the starkness and the reality of that, 50% of all the grain comes from Ukraine. The impact, therefore, in terms of what that's going to mean in terms of price increases and the ability to reach the same amount of people will cost substantially more, or else fewer people will be reached with life-saving assistance. That's the reality of what is now happening. So really we need to look at what Ireland, I think, should be doing in terms of responding and what we should continue to do, which I believe is the first and most important thing, is we should continue to support the humanitarian action that we have been carrying out in Ukraine. The government has made 20 million available in terms of humanitarian response. That's across a range of things, including medical supplies and a whole host of areas that people will be familiar with. We've also put 2 million available in the last couple of weeks to our NGO sector. I think that's very important. And we asked those NGOs to work in terms of providing us with a plan as to how they can partner with local organizations to deliver on the ground as fast and effectively as possible. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund, that's allocated 60 million to the Ukrainian crisis. Ireland, by the way, is the 11th largest donor there. And our contribution for 2022 will be about 11.5 million. So, we are responding on a multi-layered way. It's part of what we always do in terms of our response. We respond directly and immediately, individually as a country, but we also respond through the big international organizations who are able to be active and immediate on the ground. Now, we're also talking about, though, and I think this is very important to recognize, that since, say, 2021, we've contributed over 41 million in bilateral humanitarian support to other drought-affected countries. That's right across Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia. We'll provide 25 million this year to the World Food Programme. So what we are doing in Ukraine is in addition, and it is not at the expense of. And I think that is very important. I think it's very important in terms of where we're going in the future on this. And what we need to do is be conscious of our response and make sure that our response in Ukraine is there. But we also need to be conscious of the fact that since I became minister and long before that, there are a number of ongoing and protracted situations in which we are one of the key responders. Now, I think also the government has been actively engaged with the international partners developing policy and programs for import-reliant developing countries affected by crisis. What we do is we work to ensure a rapid, coordinated and coherent response. And that is very important, I think, because it's part of how you respond and how quickly you respond. Last week, the International Fund for Agricultural Development launched an initiative to support the most affected countries and farmers to withstand the cost increases, the cost of inputs that are going to really hit them, to deal with things like market turbulence, to deal with food price-rise levels. Now, Ireland provides just over 4 million per year, and it's also a member of the executive board there steering that response. And that's one of the key areas that we were anxious to see, was we recognise that there is a huge destabilising factor that's going to come about through this inflation, particularly into input costs, and we need to be active on the ground straight away. We're using our position, very importantly and very critically, on the United Nations Security Council to try and mitigate some of the broader effects. I will be in New York shortly, and there will be a series of meetings around food security systems taking place in New York, which I will be participating in. I think there needs to be an international and growing recognition of the risks associated with what food insecurity will mean for the planet. So I think that is a combination of the things we're going to have to do. That's right the way down from the very big stuff, right the way down to working with small farm holders, with people in rural communities, that assisting them and helping them with planting and harvesting in the immediacy. The final thing, though, I would say is, that's a lot of the short-term response. And obviously, when you're caught up in a situation where we are with Ukraine at the moment, and you're caught up in the situation that we are in terms of what inflation is going to do to food security and food pricing. But you have to remember the longer approach, the longer systems that we need to. At the UN Food Systems and Nutrition Growth Summits last year, our government committed 800 million over the next 5 years. And that 800 million is to help work with countries in terms of assisting them in the transformation of their national food systems. And it is really, really important that that work continues and that we recognize that work. Colm, you mentioned it earlier on in terms of Tom's work. The Food Vision 2030 strategy, which we launched last year, was one of the first national food system strategies in the world. But we need to continue to that global vision on food. If we don't realize and start fighting that scourge of hunger, what we will see, I believe, in a very immediate future is we will see the impact on the lack of food security continuing to drive up, probably to levels not seen before, migration and movement of people as a result, directly as a result of climate change and the lack of sustainable food. So we have a very big task in both the immediacy of what we're facing over the next 12 months and in the longer term of what we're facing. And longer term is only in the next couple of years, because for a lot of the countries which we support at this moment, climate change is an absolute reality, and the impact for them on their food systems has already been devastating. So we need that combination of work. We're committed to it as a government, we're committed to it through our EU partners, and we're committed to supporting it through the international organizations in which we're involved. And I'll leave it there for the moment and look forward to any questions which might come about. Hope I haven't been too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Brophy, and I appreciate you mentioning the food systems approach. I think it's something that's very, if you like, modern. I know it's something that Tom champions a lot as well. I think it's a way we have to look at, if you like, the broader picture of food and food security into the future. And next up, we have Pauline Weil, a research analyst at Bruegel. And I think the real thing that I like about where Pauline's coming at this from is she's hoping to give us an overview of the bigger picture of where the world is at in terms of markets. And I think that, if you like, sets a context for the broader picture. So over to you, Pauline, and I'll leave the rest to yourself.
Thanks a lot. So yes, indeed, I'll try to give you a bit of the macro view of what's going on. Also, a lot of it has been largely introduced and covered by the minister, but better twice than never. So next slide, please. So yes, just trying to give the context on food. The first problem we're faced with, in addition to the question of is there a supply shock because of the war in Ukraine, the thing that we're seeing first is an increase in prices. Interestingly, I mean, so on the chart you see food inflation. So it's broken down by categories. The most important one is probably the dotted line, the dotted red line, which is the condensed, the aggregate one, basically. So I think the main message that, one of the main messages that I would like you to understand is that when the war in Ukraine started, inflation on food, but also on energy, was already at historically high level. That was mostly because of, you had slower economic activity during 2 years of COVID, and then growth started to pick up really fast again, and that put pressure on prices, and including food and energy. And when the war in Ukraine broke out, what happened is that markets just continued to anticipated that there would be less supply of grain worldwide, and so that increased the pressure on prices even before, you know, any actual supply shock had materialized. Coming back to also what was mentioned by the minister, the last time prices were so high, this is what started the Arab Spring movements in a lot of the Middle East. And so just to understand the importance of these kind of indices, it's that they give us an idea of the extent to which there is food security everywhere, but also an idea into the future of, you know, social stability and the capacity that people have to buy staples that includes mostly food and energy on a daily basis influences a lot on their decisions to migrate or to make a revolution. Next slide, please. So yeah, now trying to look at what actually is the role of Russia and Ukraine on these global food markets. So together, Russia and Ukraine account for 12% of global food traded calories. So indeed, that is a lot. What we do have to remember, though, is that there's a difference between the amount of food worldwide that is traded and the amount of food worldwide that is produced. So essentially, if you look to the left, you have a bar chart where you see where Ukraine and Russia play a particularly big role. So the big ones is sunflower oil, and you might remember from the slide before that it's actually the commodity that has been really pushing inflation prices really high. You might have noticed in your supermarkets that most vegetable oils are getting a lot more expensive. And then you have stuff like wheat and barley. So in these markets, indeed, Russia and Ukraine play a big role. But then again, and that is, I think, one of the main messages that we have to get through today is that although Russia and Ukraine play a big role in what is traded, and especially Ukraine, because most of what it produces food-wise is exported, because it's still, you know, a big country land-wise with not that big a population. But there's other countries like, I don't know, the United States, Europe, thanks to the cap, or Australia, that are also producing a lot and that could compensate for these exports. But so yeah, anyways, looking at this so far on what can we anticipate on the impact of the war on these traded commodities, I mean, it's really hard to anticipate for sure. Obviously, it will depend on the course of the timeline of the war that no one can have a sure opinion on. It seems that harvests for next year, some of it at least will be lessened, but also the big problem that we have is that a lot of the infrastructure that was used before to export the grain, and so mostly through the Black Sea and the ports, this infrastructure seems to have been largely destroyed, and so it does seem that we are going to have a long-term supply shock. So that is to say, a long-term decrease in the grain that is coming out of Ukraine. Next slide, please. Great. So looking at another of the challenges that we're faced with. So with Ukraine not producing or not being able to export, we're going to have less food exported on global markets. The other problem we have is the fertilizer issue. Less fertilizer essentially means that even in a country that is, I don't know, self-sustainable, because you have less capacity to buy fertilizers, possibly your harvest is going to be less big. So that's, you know, a double shock to the amount of food we have worldwide. As you see to the left, so basically the numbers show the value of traded fertilizers in $1 billion, and then the percentage show the share in global traded fertilizers. As you see, Russia and Belarus make up a big chunk of global traded fertilizers, and actually, well, 20%. Why is there pressure on these prices? As you saw to the right, I put 3 bullet points. So the first problem is, as you've probably heard, there is an extensive number of sanctions on Russia and Belarus, which make it really hard to just buy the fertilizers from them. The second thing is that fertilizers are extremely energy hungry to produce them, and given the high prices of energy at the moment, it's getting more and more costly to just buy them or produce them. And so we're faced with the United States right now is trying to, do these trade-offs of how to decide, should we buy as much fertilizers as we used to secure high harvests, or do the other thing, but risk putting even more pressure on the food supply. Next slide. Yeah, great. And so coming back to also what the minister was saying, our question now is which country is most exposed? To the left, we tried to compute this by showing which countries rely the most on imports in their consumption. So that is to say, given what they produce nationally, what they export and what they import in terms of food, how much do they rely on exports? And that's the x-axis there. And then to the right, you have the countries that rely the most on Ukraine. And so essentially the countries that are in most trouble are the ones that either rely most on Ukraine. So as you see, these are Europe and Central Asian countries, or the ones that rely the most on imports in general, which are Middle East and North African countries. Because for these countries, essentially, even if they used to import the grain from another country, if global prices are more expensive and they have short fiscal capacity, short economic capacity to absorb this extra cost, they are in quite trouble. And so to the right, you have just a list of the countries that are most exposed. And some of the countries that don't even appear here because we have a lack of statistics on them are countries like Yemen, like Libya, like Lebanon that appears here, that are countries that were already faced with food insecurity situations. And this is where, there's a humanitarian crisis that is just already unraveling, and where the humanitarian aid efforts that the minister was mentioning are becoming more and more necessary. Yeah, next slide. And so looking forward, I tried here to just summarize a bit what we have as a challenge. So to remember, so on the first, I tried to look at the European level initiatives and then at the international perspective. So on the at the European level, of course, there's no food security situation that is looming. However, inflation is going to be felt, and especially felt by the lower income households. And if there is this inequity in higher prices, you might remember the crisis of the Gilets jaunes in France. It's when energy prices were considered to be too high, and that also sparked public unrest for good or bad reasons. That is not the point, but it's just to say that these higher prices in Europe will have impacts. And so policies like VAT cuts, or it's a political decision that has to be made, but they could be considered. And then on the international perspective, there's the humanitarian aid category, but also one of the main messages that I would like to leave you with is that at the international level, we really have, as European countries, to press other countries to limit protectionist policies, because we're in a situation when everyone has been panicking, where markets are panicking, so prices are growing bigger and bigger, and so countries are also panicking about not having able to feed themselves. And so we have at the moment 16 countries that have imposed export bans. So it's like countries like Russia has imposed ban on grains, Indonesia on palm oil, or whichever. And so these countries, by restricting trade, they also increase the pressure on prices. So we have to, understand that this is not necessarily a supply issue in itself. It's more of a logistic issue. And so when also the minister mentioned that 50% of the grain of the World Food Programme comes from Ukraine, it means that now it has to come from elsewhere. And where is it going to come from? It can come from Australia, from India, from the United States, where there is excess grain, but it's just that it does take longer to get there, because a boat from Australia takes 3 weeks to get to Europe. And so in this sense, we have to, on the one hand, be more cold-headed, but also approach this as a logistical challenge. And so moving forward in the future, we might think of that it's important to have storage infrastructure, especially in low-income countries like in the Middle East, where they produce absolutely no grain for themselves, where they need to have some storage in order to, in case such a supply shock ever happened. And then in the longer term, I think, but this will be discussed further, is there will be a challenge of renewed pressures to maybe trade off some sustainability policies that have been put forward with the food to farm strategy, and these are, you know, the triangles that will have to be decided upon and continue. I think my time is running out, so let me wrap up, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And it's good to get that broader perspective in terms of, it sets a lot of context in terms of where we're coming from. Next, we'll move on to Natasha Foote. As I say, Natasha works with EURACTIV, and she's a agri-food health journalist. So she wants to look at it from the European perspective. Natasha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting panel discussion about this very important but very sobering topic. So yes, as highlighted by the previous panelists, the war in Ukraine has caused, you know, all kinds of havoc in the agri sector, between soaring fertilizer prices, food prices, significant trade disruptions. So really in complete disarray. And we've heard a lot now about the global perspective on food security. As you said, Colm, I'm here to give the perspective from the EU. And in Brussels here, food security, you know, is the term on everyone's lips at the moment. It's become the key conversation, not just in the agri-food sector, but actually it's spilled over into, you know, all kinds of sectors. Everyone's talking about it. What's interesting though, talking about the European response, is that there's a very confusing narrative coming from the Commission about the best way to respond to this crisis. And it's caused all kinds of tension between different stakeholders. So basically the EU executive has insisted time and time again that there's no risk of food insecurity, at least in the EU, and that the biggest issue is food prices. So food accessibility rather than availability, just as Pauline was speaking about just then. You know, the story may be different elsewhere, but I'm speaking purely from the European perspective. Now, even though that is the line, the response has still been basically that we need to produce more food. So the question is, if the key issue in the EU is accessibility, you know, why has there been this push on production? So there's been some interesting responses on this for the EU Agriculture Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski. The reason is, you know, basically just in case, you know, he's saying that we don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how long the war will continue for. And so he sees that it is, in his words, speaking in his words, simply prudent to up food production. But there is another more structural reason that the EU is actually very limited in its capacity to help on with anything to do with affordability. Now, the main action of the EU is via the EU's farming subsidy programme, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. But this was originally conceived as a way to increase production, so logically offers a range of kind of production-orientated measures. And so basically the Commission has a very limited range of tools in its toolbox to help on anything when it comes to food prices, the social side of things, which we've heard already during this panel discussion. And so we've landed in a situation where the real push is being put on food production, and this framing of the problem has led to the decision to, for example, temporarily postpone some of the environmental measures for this year, meaning that farmers are able to plant crops in ecologically sensitive areas, for example. Now, this hasn't gone down very well with proponents of the Green Deal. We've ended up in a situation where we have the two sides of the Commission kind of pitted against each other in this very old school kind of fight about food production versus the focus on environmental measures. So in the one corner, we have the EU Agricultural Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski saying we have to do more to produce more. In the other, we have Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans saying that the narrative around food security is in his words, dishonest and irresponsible. He says it sets the EU on a dangerous path away from its environmental ambitions. So I'm very happy to go into more details about why this is during the panel discussion, but essentially in summary, the line is that the food supply is not at stake in the EU, despite the ongoing war in Ukraine, but soaring food prices may mean that low-income households will struggle to access this food. And that risk is very, very real. And of course, the risk of starvation, of not being able to access food, is a very, very real one. But we are hearing a quite confusing and at times conflicting narrative coming out of the EU Commission about the best way to respond to this challenge. And there's this push on upping food production, which is actually deepening the cracks between different factions, between environmental proponents, the agri-food world. So that's kind of the summary, the response at the European level in a nutshell. Very happy to discuss further on this, and also, as you said, Colm, to talk a little bit about the response on the ground in Ukraine, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, and thanks for that contribution. And just before we go any further, I'd just like to remind people to put their questions in the chat. Everyone's been very shy this evening. It's not typical of what we got normally, but it'd be great if we could just get a few questions into the chat that we come to the panel after the 4 presentations. And I'll go now, without going any further, to Tom Arnold, who has, I suppose, a great in-depth in terms of if you like, development aid, but also in terms of the food systems approach, which is so intrinsical, I suppose, in terms of developing countries, but equally as relevant in, let's say, European countries as well. So, Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Colm. I'm very pleased to follow 3 contributions of such high quality here, because Ukraine crisis has indeed, as Natasha says, put the whole question of food security right front and central into political and policy debate. I'd like maybe to just respond by talking about the short term and then the longer term. Minister Brophy spelled out very clearly what he called the multi-layered approach that Ireland is taking to this current crisis, and I think it's a very good one. It's well thought out, and it's using our strengths to connect with our major partners at international level. But he was also very clear that we have to see this short-term response in the longer-term framework, and that I think is actually very important. Pauline spelled out some really interesting perspective. And one of the slides she showed was about the current historically high price levels. But we do need to look at this in the longer time frame. And if we look at an index of food prices from 1960 to 2020, a 60-year period, the overall trend has been downwards in terms of the real price of food. We have had along the way a number of price spikes. One of the most notable ones was indeed in 2007, 2008, when we had the food price crisis. 3 or 4 years later, we had another price spike, which was also referred to the Arab Spring. And now we have this price spike, and we don't know how long this is going to last. It depends obviously on both the length of this conflict and the outcome of the conflict. The length, everybody hopes that there's going to be a relatively short term, but it could be otherwise. The outcome, in terms of what final settlement will be and how much, if Ukraine is to lose part of its current territory, and in particular, if Odessa was to become threatened, that becomes or fall to Russia, that becomes then much more serious, and that's where the current price crisis, which in certain circumstances could revert back to normal in a relatively short time, depending on the outcome of the conflict. But if something as drastic as Odessa falling into Russian hands, and an infrastructure for global trade being undermined, that becomes then a very different situation. So that's the really big uncertainty. What to do, how all we can do, I think, at the moment is do the range of measures that the minister spoke about in terms of, from an Irish point of view, that multi-layered approach. But when we look at the global response, there is already in place a fairly well-structured response emerging. I was in Washington last week and speaking a lot to the World Bank, and the World Bank has come up with, if you like, almost with three responses. One, the very short term, in fact, what's to happen over the next 2 to 3 months. What they're calling a medium term, but which is still another version of the short term, is what to do over the next 15 months. And then, of course, there's the longer term issue, and then we'll come back to that in a moment. But the bank is attempting to focus its efforts on for Ukraine itself, on the countries that are receiving the largest number of refugees from Ukraine, and then on the wider knock-on, what they're calling the spillover effects of this crisis. The spillover effects being in terms of higher food prices and what impact that's having on particularly on the vulnerable areas. And they rank in different levels. I mean, the countries that are already in trouble and have been in trouble for some time, as the minister spoke about, trouble because of climate and because of conflict, they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. And we're talking here about Yemen, we're talking about the Horn of Africa, and that's where the humanitarian focus has to be. But then you've got another category of countries, and which I think most people were not aware of, the degree of dependence that places like the Middle East and North Africa are on imports from Russia, Ukraine. Now they're not as obviously they're in a different income situation than the first category I spoke about, but they have very real problems. And this brings us to perhaps some of the longer term impacts, or potentially longer term impacts of this crisis. That some of these countries, I think we're going to see two things that are going to manifest themselves. One is that countries that are highly dependent on imports at the moment from Russia, Ukraine, are going to seek to diversify their trading arrangements. Because from an overall global point of view, there is not now, and there is not likely to be in the short to medium term future, any global shortage of food. But many of these countries that are dependent for maybe 80% of their imports from Russia, Ukraine, are going to have to find alternative sources. And then the second thing that I think is going to come into play is that both at a country level and at a regional level, many countries are going to have to rethink what their own food and nutrition security policy should be, and to work towards being better, work towards investing more in improving their own food and nutrition security policy. And this is where we get back to the connection with Ireland and its current policy on the promotion of sustainable food systems, both within our own country, as expressed through Food Vision 2030, but then advocating for this at international level, because this notion of sustainable food systems is going to become ever more relevant and deserving of political prioritization in the years ahead. And this is where we get to link the short and the longer term perspective. The longer term perspective that we should be looking at, I think, is following up on the progress made in the three important international meetings last year. the Food System Summit in September, the COP26 in November, and the Nutrition for Growth in December. And I'm very glad to say that Ireland made a substantial contribution, both intellectually and policy-wise, and indeed financially, to each of these meetings. But there now is a question as to how can we take what was decided and committed to at those meetings, and how can we really deliver on those commitments. And the Ukrainian crisis it has to bring home to all of us that issue of sustainable food systems and working towards that in the longer term becomes ever more important. A first, if you like, set piece event in that regard is in September of next year, when all of the countries that made commitments at the Food System Summit are going to come back to a UN forum to say, well, what have we delivered or not delivered? And Ireland, we are working towards being able to make a substantial contribution to that meeting, and I think that's indeed proper and right. So that's how I would, if you like, want to contribute to the opening conversation. I think we've had three excellent contributions, and I think we're now set for whatever time we have remaining to us to have a really useful conversation. Back to you, Colm.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I'm delighted with all the contributions, I have to say. And I think just the comments you make at the end there, and it's interesting that, if you like, the summits that happened last year all predated the current crisis, and yet are so relevant, I suppose, in the debate that we're having, because we do need to look at this broader food systems approach and how we make a supply of food. I think food security perhaps was thought to be an agenda that was long since gone, and certainly in priorities at policy level, and I think it's brought it very much back into focus to the current situation. There's a number of questions that have come in, and I encourage people to put more in to start to continue the discussions. But I suppose to begin with, I'll come to E.C. Lindstad, who has asked about safe and nutritious food for all agenda, and particularly the most vulnerable people. I think this has been hit from a number of contacts, particularly when you mentioned, Tom, in your comments about, let's say, the Middle East, with, let's say, the buying, wouldn't have a supply of food, but they have the buying capacity to look for alternative routes. And that's going to squeeze other people out of the market who are a lot more vulnerable and a lot less disposable income, if you like. Like, how do we ensure that the poorer nations of the world are not the ones that are the biggest victims in this situation? I'll go perhaps to the Minister first, if you can pick up on that, please.
Okay, well, I think that is really important, that our first port of call in terms of thinking about this is to ensure there is a security there for the most poorest, the people who are furthest behind, that we think of them first and that we act for them first. You're going to see some pretty immediate action, as I mentioned, on a UN level on the 18th of May. The American government, who will assume the Security Council chairing for that period of time, are going to push front and center food security and the global food security call to action program, as they're going to call it, which I will be attending a meeting. It will be chaired by Secretary Blinken, and it is primarily going to focus on these key issues of the immediate response in terms of that and the longer term food system. It is going to require, I think, developed countries to realize that we're going to have to put more into supporting things like the World Food Programme. If we don't do that, you have a twofold impact, and Tom is alluding to this quite correctly, which is for the very developed world, for richer countries, the impact is going to be a financial impact on the cost of food. But if poorer developing countries start to engage in a war just to guarantee the supply of food, they will become very quickly the losers who will end up coming out hardest of, ironically, a war that is on the far side of the planet from them. So I think we need to strengthen the international response. We need to make sure that we put funding in place to enable organizations like the World Food Programme to continue to respond. We need to, which I know is controversial, but we need to look at how we ramp up production, because we ironically have a situation where there is abilities to ramp up production in other areas, which we must do, because if we're taking out a supply area there, then it's not so much that that supply went either directly to an affected country, but if it went to a country which is now going to have to buy its supply from elsewhere very, very quickly, the poorest of the poor will start to lose. So it's the international response. It's a UN level based response. I think the EU has an absolutely critical role to play in this. We are in that privileged group of countries where we're not going to see per se any type of food shortage. We'll see the price increases, but that's not good enough as a response. We must make sure that collectively that we play our part to ensuring that the poorest of poor countries, and I mean this in a very generalized way, you do that for the right reasons. You do that for the humanitarian reasons. You do that for the moral reasons. But you also do that for a reason from the EU perspective, which is of self-interest. Because the impact of destabilization in these countries, the impact of collapsing supplies of food in these countries is one that will be felt on a global basis and will come back, I believe, if we don't respond as an international community, to have severe impact in the coming years on both Ireland and the EU.
Thank you, Minister. And now, if I could turn to Natasha, perhaps what's your perspective on this?
Perspective on increasing production?
In terms of, let's say, the vulnerability that leaving nobody behind, in terms of the smaller country, the more vulnerable countries possibly being priced out of the market, if you like, in terms of places like the Middle East that has the income, disposable income to actually take source elsewhere.
It's absolutely, I mean, absolutely, you're right. There's some countries that are incredibly vulnerable to this, as we've spoken about, and the countries that are incredibly import dependent. And of course, the price hikes will impact them the most, as we've spoken about. What I would say is that every time I've put, and I think we've just spoken about it just now, but every time I've put this question to the Commission of, you know, okay, so if we're producing excess food, how can we make sure that it's fairly and equitably distributed? And they didn't really have a good response to me about how they're strengthening the logistics of the trade. And I think Pauline spoke about this, you know, because actually there is plenty of, if we take, for example, wheat, there is actually plenty of wheat in the world. Farmers also were very aware that there were maybe problems coming. I know that as early as last November, which is when the wheat would have been, as a winter crop, would have been started to be sown, farmers around the world were planting more wheat. And there's a lot of wheat in global stockpiles, talking about China, India, the US, many other nations have got a lot of storage of wheat. Australia had a record-breaking year, a bumper crop in 2021. But I would touch more upon the issue that Pauline raised about logistics, because of course this is going to create a major issue of how do we ship this wheat around, rather than maybe focusing on the production issue, talking about how, you know, maybe we can increase the number of ships or the number of the capacity or whatever. As Pauline also mentioned, I think it would take about 3 weeks to get from Australia, whereas from other places we have already strengthened channels. And so I think, you know, from that perspective, in terms of safeguarding these incredibly vulnerable countries, I think it's more of a question of logistics and how we get an equitable sharing of the resources and the food resources that are already existing in the world. And the same goes for logistics of getting supplies out of Ukraine, because we also know that there's some 20 million, I think there was the German minister was talking about this yesterday. There's some 20 million tons of wheat from the last harvest sitting in Ukraine, but from March, only 200,000 tons have been able to be exported. Now, of course, it's incredibly logistically difficult to get this out of Ukraine for obvious reasons. And we're talking a lot about, you know, strengthening rail and other options, and looking at other options there for how we can get this wheat and the food resources in Ukraine to where it needs to be, and to these most vulnerable countries, as we've spoken about.
Thank you very much. And Tom, perhaps you have a perspective? Tom, you're muted there.
Yeah, Natasha raised the point about this focus now in certain, both in Europe, about the response from, let's call it the agricultural sector, saying that what is needed is to increase production. There's similar response happening in the United States. This is, I think, a kind of a false debate. I think there may indeed need to be some. First of all, there's actually limited amount you can do in the short term to increase production. But if people are really serious about helping poor countries become less vulnerable, it's not through increasing production in Europe and America that is the answer to this. It's through the sustained effort to help these countries improve their own food security, their own capacity to increase their own production. And that's where, I mean, Africa is a very, very good example of this, where there's huge potential in Africa to increase their own production. There's a very rapidly growing demand for food in Africa, which can increasingly be met by African production itself rather than by imports. And what Europe should be doing, I think, and it was spelled out in a document that I chaired a few years ago, something called the Task Force Rural Africa. It was a policy document produced in 2019. And that was a central message, that Africa has to look after, to a greater degree than it is at the moment, its own food security. And this current crisis really emphasizes the importance of that message. Now, that's beginning to happen. I mean, the African Development Bank has set aside a credit line, for example, of $1 billion to enable the continent of Africa, across the many countries, to increase wheat production, to basically to substitute for currently what Africa is importing from Russia and Ukraine. So that's the sort of thinking that I think we need to acknowledge and encourage for the future. But a simplistic view that the Ukraine crisis gives a license to just increase production in Europe and in America, I don't think is the right conclusion.
Now, just a question that's come in there from John Gilliland is in relation, I suppose it's one of the big debates, and I think it was a Pauline that mentioned it earlier, or Natasha, I think it was, maybe I'll come to you first on it, about the playoff, if you like, the environmental side versus the food production side. Can we increase food production in a sustainable way, or are they in conflict with each other? I know you sort of suggested that they were in conflict, it's, at least within the Commission they're in conflict. But is there a way in which we can pull the two together and create a sustainable model where food production can be, if you ranked up, but also in a way that does not damage your environment? I'll come to Natasha and maybe to Pauline then after that.
Well, that is the the big question, the million euro question. Yeah, it depends obviously on your perspective as you're coming to this. But I think the key thing to think about here is that it's important to keep one eye in the short term and one eye in the long term. And, you know, even if you're increasing production and foregoing all of the environmental measures now, of course, the looming crisis we have with climate change and with soil degradation and everything else will make us much more food insecure in the future. So if you're talking about, you know, long-term sustainability, long-term viability, you know, that's the kind of viewpoint to have, and talking about we want production to be going into the future and not just now. I think I did mention that the Commission has temporarily offered a derogation on certain environmental measures this year, and so that basically means that areas that were, you know, set aside for ecological purposes they're now going to be allowed to be planted. There's other talks about derogations on the nitrate directive, things like that. This is supposedly for 1 year. a temporary derogation, it's caused a lot of controversy from people who are saying that this is a short-sighted approach to take. There's a lot of concerns about it, and also a lot of concerns about the amount of food that this sometimes very marginal land will actually be able to produce and actually be able to help with the situation. So yes, but there are these derogations on environmental measures currently, and there's a lot of concern about the impact this will have in the long term. And so I think that's what I would say to this question, that we have to keep one eye now, one eye in the future, and look at long-term sustainability of food systems. And that would require, looking at everything we're talking about with the farm to fork, with the Green Deal, and looking at these sustainable measures that have been put forward.
Pauline, from your perspective, do you see a way in which we can have a sustainable model that enhances, like, let's face it, we're looking at apart from anything else, we're looking at a population growth into the future. People are saying it'll go from less than 8 billion to 10 billion in the next 20 to 30 years. So we need to save our environment. We also need to feed the people. Can it be done?
I mean, so now you're coming at it from a more long-term perspective. In the short-term perspective, I think I would agree with Tom that the Ukraine crisis is not necessarily a license to increase production, because, as we said, there is enough supply, there is enough food to feed everyone. It's just a matter to give it in the plate of the people who need it, I guess. And then at the EU level, I mean, on this trade-off you're talking about between sustainability and productivity, essentially. In the long term, of course, we have to save the people, but if the planet is burning, then it doesn't work either. So, just looking at other numbers, my question would be, why do we need to increase production? Because if I saw at the EU level, of all the food that we have, only 1/3 is used to feed humans, 2/3 is used to feed animals, and then on all of this, there's 20% of all the food available that just goes to waste. And so if, in the sense of saying, why do we need to change production, to increase production? Is it just because we cannot politically or socially tackle these other issues where we have really room to just do more with what we already have? Which might be politically more difficult and more challenging, but I think first these options have to be put forward. And the one-off exemptions, I completely understand the backlash that has been happening at the EU level of wanting to preserve the wins of the Green Deal.
Tom, from your perspective, I suppose the food systems approach is very much looking at the balance between production and, if you like, sustainability. Do you see a clear way forward in terms of how we can deal with this situation?
Well, I think inevitably the current situation with higher input prices and concerns along those lines is going to lead to some adjustment in policy. And I mean, I think perfectly sensible things like what the Minister McConnell here has done to set up a group to think ahead about how the forage needs for next autumn and winter are to be met and what practical measures should be taken to do this. And I would see the announcement today whereby cattle and sheep farmers are being incentivized to produce more silage for the coming season. They're all, sensible responses, I think, to a new situation. But on the basic issue of is there some kind of basic trade-off that has to be made between increasing production and thereby reducing or being willing to sacrifice environmental standards, I don't think I don't think this can be accepted. I think we're the current situation means that increased production has to be done in a sustainable way. And that's at the very heart of what Food Vision 2030 has spelled out. It has spelled out a vision and the policies to go with it for how Ireland can create a sustainable food system that is, and sustainable in its three dimensions of economic, environmental, and social. And within that, there are indeed going to have to be compromises and trade-offs. But I think, I think in Ireland, that's what we're striving to do. And I think that basic model of saying that other countries also need their own version of sustainable food systems, and that it has to be on that triple basis of economic, environmental, and social. That's the way forward. And I don't think can be any resilement from that going into the future.
I think that is a reality. And I think just moving away from the environmental piece, just because there is a lot of questions, and I suppose try and touch them all in the short period of time. Ethan Go and indeed Patrick Mulroy, have asked two questions in relation to price inflation. I suppose Patrick is pointing to 2007 and 2008, where there was a price hike, but when normality returned, I suppose prices returned back to something close to what they had been. I suppose Aoife then is concerned equally in terms of pricing, whether we're going to see a situation where it's basically going to impact on the pocket of the ordinary people. Like, we might say there won't be shortages in Europe, but those with less disposable income may make choices to go for tin foods, or may have to go for very simple choices that aren't necessarily are impacting them, if you like, in other ways than just actually quality of food as opposed to, I suppose, quantity of food. I don't know, Minister, have you any concerns as regards the inflationary impact on prices, how it will affect people in Ireland and people in Europe in general?
Yeah, I think it ties together. Both the last question and this question tie together, because I think you can, if you get too bogged down in an ideology, you can sometimes forget the reality of that question which you've just posed there, of the impact on people living their ordinary lives. I would absolutely support the element which Tom mentioned there in his last answer. The sustainable approach is absolutely crucial in terms of what we've done here, what we continue to do. I think what we want to see other countries adopt, I think that is the long-term solution to this. I do make the point, though, I do think there has to be an increase in production. We're not just talking about food security, we are actually talking about production where it can be done sustainably in terms of impacting and mitigating the loss of production in other areas. We have a serious logistics problem already around the movement of goods. And we need to look, there is no one answer. It's not logistics, it's not food production. It's a range of measures put together. I think what we've done in the Irish government approach has been very sensible. It's been very measured. It's been combining the principles of how we want to see things, but recognizing that we're going to have some shifts in production, and possibly across Europe, some increases in production. And not just because of food security issues, but because of this key point that you've made and referenced there in terms of price inflation and the impact on that. And that's not just impacting on Europe, that's impacting on a global basis. I think what we need to be very careful with is going to the point of, we need to look now and possibly even again, even though we've only just started a process of what food security means in the context of what I believe will be a very different world situation post-Ukraine, whenever that war actually becomes a war that becomes in the past. Because we lived under a context of believing how countries would behave and how global systems could react. It effectively has served us from the end of World War II, right the way through the Cold War, right the way into the international system we've lived in now. I think we've had a very, very instant and crude and rude wake-up call as to where we are going to be possibly in the second half of this century, because if we don't address the global climate questions, we're going to see, I believe, substantial more pressure on areas around international institutions. And part of that, it will all boil down to eventually things like food security, fuel security, and generally the rule of international order. And I think that's a lot of big questions. But in the immediacy, two things. One, we've got to look at price inflation on the impact on European citizens and Irish citizens, and we've got to look at how we deal with that. In the longer run, we're going to have to look at global food systems, which are locally based. That point Tom was making about, which I totally subscribe to, about the development of agriculture within Africa as a solution. It delivers on both. It delivers on both tackling, I believe, around the climate issue and tackling the food security issue, and as a win-win. So these are the type of things, but we're going to see, I think, some very major changes, and we have to be open in our thinking as to how we respond to them, because there is no one simple answer to the response to the crisis we're facing.
Look, I could probably put that question to everyone, but I'll perhaps move on with some of the others because there's a number coming in. Just a whole, and I think one or two of the speakers mentioned it earlier. I think Tom referenced back to a profile of, if you like, the cost of food since the 1960s. And I suppose the question that Lawrence Lally is asking is, like, below cost production, and farmers have had to take a very low price for their food production in the past. Are those days over? And has that low value, I suppose, in food been part of the problem here, that we thought food security was the thing of the past? Food was becoming a less and less part of people's disposable income. And is that part of our lack of respect of the importance of food security? Has that some of what got us to where we are today? I don't know if Pauline, if you want to pick up on that, maybe Tom then.
I'm sorry, I think I missed a word in your question.
Just in terms of the cost of food and the fact that food has been produced below the cost of production in the last number of years, and the importance of food security perhaps, and the level of food that people are disposable income people are spending on food. The trend of that over the last 10, 15 years, has that led us partly to where we find ourselves today?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of mention of the food system, and I mean, I look at it more from the economics point of view, where how do we say? It's a system with lots of actors that are all trying to negotiate their way through it, and I think, yeah, we've had problems with costs of productions and just balance of powers between big industrials, between sometimes producers and then households, because I mean, what we've had also with what we're seeing now with the difference in food prices is the extent to which it impacts differently different household levels, and the problem of malnutrition, that even in Europe, where we have no problem of food security, the questions of who is eating food that is the least healthy is the lower income households. And so in that sense, there's a lot of policy and policy options here, and that plays through taxes and VAT orientations on how to influence this kind of consumptions.
And Tom, what's your sense? Do you think the food policy that has saw people spending less and less of their income on food has left us partly where we are today? You're on mute, Tom.
Sorry, Colm. Now, I start with a basic point. I mean, for many years, people talked about food security. And one of the outcomes of the food price crisis in 2007, 2008, was we changed the language, and we were talking about food and nutrition security. And the reason for that was that you can have, at the aggregate level, food security, and that there's enough food to go around. But you can have then a cohort of the poorest people who are not nutritionally secure. So we really actually have to keep that focus on that broader concept of food and nutrition security. Now, there is a case that as the price of food, the real price of food, has systematically reduced over a 60-year period, that, and that has meant that people are devoting a smaller share of their income to food, to food, or they're spending less on food, basically less of their total income on food, and they've got used to that. And now we're in a period of high food inflation, and people are looking for cheaper alternatives, as Pauline has said. And here we have the dilemma, because an adequate income, how can that circle be squared if food prices keep falling? And particularly, and farmers will argue this, and they have argued this for decades, that their share of what the consumer is paying, the farmer's share is reducing. So there's some very basic dilemmas to face up to here. And I mean, I don't have the answers, but I think there's going to have to be society is going to have to recognize that, you know, if farmers are to be kept in business, they have to get a better price for the food that they're producing. And it's certainly, they cannot, below cost selling, there's something fundamentally wrong with that. So, you know, trying to, this is where we get back to the dilemma. How do you actually achieve economic, environmental, and social sustainability? There's not an easy answer to this, but you know, certainly in the current debate, or the current realization that food price inflation means that, you know, a lot of people are having to change their food consumption habits. It poses a real, and the minister acknowledges it. This ultimately is you know, a serious political problem.
Indeed, and I think that probably brings us to our next question, which comes from Noel Barden from the Farmers Journal, and that's in relation to the Ukraine crisis. Will it shape a change in the cap from 23 to 27? Do we need to review or revise our cap proposals to take in light of the current situation? Perhaps I'll come to Natasha first on this, given that you're looking at it from the EU perspective. Do you think we have to relook at cap?
Definitely, yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, the member states are currently in the process of drafting their national strategic plans. So through these plans, that's the way that the member states outline how they're going to hit the EU's main ambitions for the CAP. And there's this process of a kind of a conversation, a back and forth between the Commission and member states, which is already ongoing. After the first drafts were submitted, they were submitted before the war. And the Commission's basically turned around and said, look, you need to have a stronger emphasis on resilience now in your plans. These need to change. You need to put a stronger emphasis on how you can safeguard food security, et cetera, in the future. And so it does look like definitely this war will probably have a longer lasting impact on the CAP, on the rollout of the CAP, and the way in which member states are going to be implementing their national strategic plans. What that really means in practice, we're still not really sure, because there's, as I said, there's still this ongoing dialogue between the Commission and member states in terms of what that actually means, you know, on the ground. But yes, there is a revision in process of these plans, actively encouraged by the Commission to reinforce certain elements to strengthen the sector's resilience and self-reliance in light of the Ukraine war. So, you know, this is the CAP reform that will run until 2027. So yes, it will definitely have a longer term impact on the way that the CAP is rolled out.
Pauline, have you any thoughts on that? Does CAP have to change?
Honestly, I think I agree with Natasha's point, but I don't think I have any specific ones that I want to add.
Okay. Just in relation to then moving on, the role of small farmers, and I know, I think it was Natasha, you were saying as regards small farmers in the Ukraine and their role. Where is the role for small farmers, Jim Harrison wants to know, or what's the future for small farmers as much as anything in this food security scenario? Natasha?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'll give there may be a perspective from Ukraine and then maybe enlarge it slightly to the rest of the EU. But there's been an interesting scenario, a situation happening in Ukraine currently, where small farmers, now I have to specify that small for Ukrainians doesn't translate to the way that we would think of a small farmer. We're talking here a farm that's under 100 hectares. So already for me, that seems like a big farm. But in Ukraine, they count as a small farm. And, you know, typically, historically, these small farms have been largely overlooked by the Ukrainian government in favor of large agribusiness. So, for example, they haven't qualified for state aid. They haven't been recognised as a farm. But what's interesting in the light of the war is that these small, I use small in this way, farmers have actually becoming increasingly key for ensuring this food security on the ground in Ukraine currently. And this contribution is quite considerable. I've been speaking to people from farmers associations in Ukraine and in the surrounding areas. And, you know, there's estimates that as much as 98% of the country's total harvest for potatoes, 86% of vegetables, 85% of fruits are coming from these small farmers on the ground, whereas the larger companies, the larger farms are more export orientated. So they're more producing the wheat and the cereals. After, you know, basically there's been we obviously talk about the migration from Ukraine to other EU countries, but also within Ukraine, there's been a lot of people leaving the cities for the countryside, and these smaller farmers are basically having to take up the baton and take on the burden of trying to feed extra people and trying to do the best with the resources they have. So, you know, and the other thing being that actually Russia has been actively targeting large farms and also storage facilities in Ukraine. They are much easier to target, whereas, you know, small dispersed farmers, it's actually playing a very interesting role in terms of the country's food security. It's much more difficult to target these small farms. And of course, while aid and food programs, they have their place, they're not necessarily, you know, not necessarily sufficient enough to be able to get distributed within the country. Of course, there's many logistical problems getting aid in and out of the country currently. The problem is that also any funding for Ukrainian farmers are also being kind of used along the same lines as the Ukrainian definition of farms. So at the moment, the aid's not necessarily getting to the small farmers in Ukraine, but they are having the same issues. They're having these issues of access to inputs, pesticides, fertilizers, also seeds. You know, if they can't have the seeds, they can't sow them. And so they're having a lot of problems. And the people I've been speaking to on the ground in Ukraine are saying we have to get the money to the people that are feeding the people that are there on the ground currently. And I think that does kind of also maybe has some interesting analogies to draw other areas in terms of the diversification of the agri-food system and making sure that you've got a diversified supply coming in from different places, and the role that maybe smaller farmers can also play in ensuring food security.
And just Tom, just as I come to you on the same point about the role of small farmers and probably perhaps in an African context, I've also a question here from Alan Tobin asking about large areas of fertile land in Africa being used by Asian countries to grow food for themselves. Is there an issue of a kind of a dichotomy there where the role of small farmers has been looked at, but equally large scale, let's say, investment in places like Africa, which is diverting food away from the risk and the need for local people? I have to warn you, you're on mute again, Tom.
Sorry again, Colm. I think this is a question that every country and every region is going to has to answer for itself, because I think one of the lessons of recent years with COVID and now with the Ukrainian crisis is that farming systems and farming sectors are going to have to build in more resilience as a basic policy objective. And part of resilience is indeed, I think, a diversity of farm sizes and farm systems. So I think there's a very strong case for policy to acknowledge that and to, to try to have that as an objective. Now, if that is the case, if there is to be a societal appreciation and support for small farmers, that has to go hand in hand with a policy to making rural economies more productive, to give more opportunities from within rural economies for small farmers to survive, because inevitably small farmers are going to find it hard to make full-time incomes from their farms. So getting that balance right between agricultural policy and rural and regional policy becomes very important. Now, the question that was asked about Africa, there is indeed a risk in certain parts of Africa that big foreign investments have come in and have taken over tracts of land, large tracts of land, perhaps with some questionable political decision making. But this is I mean, I don't think it's a major problem in Africa in terms of, you know, that many countries having huge numbers of these big investments. But it is a problem in certain parts, and I think it's not something that really, I think African countries need to be very careful and very wary of going down that road.
Okay, just moving on here. I've got a couple of, we'll have to wrap up fairly soon, but a couple of key questions, I suppose. Two things. Seno Kahan has asked about, let's say, water supply, and there's an anonymous one in, I suppose, about fertilizers as well. So I suppose they're two different things, but like food supply is a factor of fertilizer, which is a factor of oil, which is one of the key things we're at the moment. Have you talked about it then in the global context of the environmental challenges that impact on food security as well? Water equally is a challenge in that space. So I don't know, maybe I'll come to you, Tom, and come to the two ladies then on that very, very quickly. Fertilizer and water supply, are they limiting our food security? Is there a risk we need to focus on one thing? We had said at the European Parliament that fertilizer should be a strategic, important, the assets for the strategic infrastructure, the production of fertilizer should be deemed as strategic infrastructure. And similarly, with a limited water supply in parts of the world, are these two limiting factors that we have to be very conscious of?
Well, I think we're not going to achieve global food and nutrition security without fertilizer. Now, I think what the current prices of fertilizer is giving rise to in Ireland, and indeed every other country, is to see how fertilizer can be used to best effect. And I think we're going to have to look at that and look at ways in which we can achieve food security with lower levels of fertilizer for all sorts of reasons, for the reasons of nature and our systems of production, but also for reasons of economics, that we should be using an important resource like this as well and as productively as possible. On the issue of water, there's probably no more fundamental question than this. Many of the regions of the world are suffering from consistent drought. We're going to have to take water a great deal more seriously everywhere. I mean, one of the reasons why the dairy sector is under threat and under pressure here in Ireland is because the rapid expansion of dairying has led to a deterioration in water quality. And society has said stop to that. There is no, you cannot argue for further dairy expansion unless you tackle the issue of water quality and start moving in the direction of improving water quality. And you have the EPA as if you like, as the independent reporter on this. And I think the dairy sector is fully now conscious of that. There's no trade-off here. The dairy sector has to deliver any further growth it's going to have while ensuring that water quality is moving in the right direction.
I think that's certainly focused minds in recent years. I think, as you say, it's probably is the limiting factor in dairy production, is to be able to maintain a sustainable production that doesn't impact negatively on our water quality. Pauline, have you any thoughts in relation to both fertiliser and water supply as a key factor towards our food security? Sorry, you're on mute, Pauline.
A common problem. So on water, I haven't looked enough in recent, well, at all actually in recent weeks. But on fertilizers, just to take the issue from a completely different angle than actual food production, is that currently it's estimated that fertilizer production is responsible for around 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And like I said before, producing fertilizers is extremely energy intensive. And so this just opens the can to other trade-offs of the sustainable transition that we have to engage in, of what energy we have, how we use it, and so just the amount of fertilizers we rely on is really intertwined with this carbon impact we have on the planet, and so to that extent, I think it has to be rationalized the way we think of the issue.
Thank you, Pauline. And Natasha, your own thoughts on fertilizer and water supply as a key factor?
Absolutely, no, absolutely. And we're already facing drought problems, is something we've been speaking about a lot recently in Southern Europe, for example. You know, many countries are already facing severe drought this year. And this is just a problem that's going to get worse and worse. I completely agree with what Tom was saying. You know, considering water resources is a massive issue, and we have to take it a lot more seriously going forward. And of course, also on fertilizers, you're absolutely right. I mean, this all kind of ties into the whole point of the EU's flagship food policy, the Farm to Fork strategy, and part of the Green Deal, you know, to reduce dependence on inputs like fertilizers. Also to, you know, it ties into water quality as well, because of reducing runoff and impacting water quality in that way. And I think that kind of comes around to why it's so important to keep the wider picture when we're doing things. We're talking about food security here, to keep the wider picture of ensuring that, you know, keeping one eye in the future and looking at these issues that are to come, and making sure that, you know, that we're moving forward sustainably in a viable way, exactly as Tom was saying earlier, in a way that's economically, socially and environmentally sustainable, because yes, this is absolutely a limiting factor, and it's something that's going to get worse and worse. Just to end on a cheery note there.
No, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I think people don't understand the amount of water that's involved in food production at every level, and I think it's a very important factor. And the point that Tom has made alongside that if our food production is having a negative effect on our water quality, water probably is our most important asset on the planet as a whole, and it's a factor of food production, but it's equally it's impacted by food production too, so to be able to get them two right is very important. Just another anonymous question that came in was in relation to women farmers and the contribution they can make. I'll come to the ladies first, I suppose. The most appropriate to start with the ladies in this one, but I know, Tom, you might have a few comments from an African perspective as well. Natasha first. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the role of, let's say, a specific role of women in terms of addressing food security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a topic that I've come to a lot and spoken a lot with various women farmers, and their crucial role in ensuring food security and in the agri-food system. I absolutely believe that they should be, you know, at the heart of the sustainability conversation that we're having in the agri-food sector. They play an absolutely crucial role, but they are often not recognised for their contribution, or don't have the support that they're needed to have the success in the agri-food sector. I know, you know, in the CAP, and I know in Ireland as well, there's actually specific provisions being put forward to try and support both young farmers and also women farmers, and I think that's can only be a positive thing, because, you know, they give such an enormous contribution to the sector. So I absolutely agree that they should be at the heart of every food security conversation that we're having.
Pauline?
I don't have specific views on this, just from a social perspective on the question that Natasha just raised of recognition. farmers in Europe and elsewhere, but even in Europe, are people that struggle to make a living, and layers of social lack of recognition or unfair socioeconomic situation just make unsustainable positions and make this sector really not attractive, whereas it's actually absolutely crucial for all Europeans.
Absolutely. And Tom, your perspective in terms of the role of women in agriculture, I suppose both here in Ireland and Europe, but equally in Africa, where I think they play an enormous part and maybe don't get recognition for the role they play.
They haven't got adequate recognition here in Ireland, and they need it. I mean, it's the role of women has been so crucial, and it hasn't been fully acknowledged and recognized. In Africa, it's of the most fundamental importance. And if there's any vision and any program to get the African agri-food sector to a different place than it is at the moment, and that's where it needs to get to, full and explicit acknowledgement of the role of women has to be at the heart of any such planning.
I agree totally, and I think that the point that Natasha makes about the sustainability piece, I think women have an enormous part to play in that too. And I think always traditionally, I suppose, agriculture has been associated with men, and too often women are carrying the can and not getting the full recognition for the role and the management role they play, in particular in farming across Europe. I think that's something we have to focus more on. But just if we can, we're pretty much running out of time, and I suppose just maybe a wrap-up point in terms of, like, food security hasn't probably been central to the agenda until more recent times, when the sustainability end of it became very important. And then in recent times with the security and the link towards those things, energy, and the fact that food is a factor of energy. This has become such an important part of, if you like, our thinking in the last couple of months. For each of you, and I'll start with you, Natasha, what's the one key thing you think we need to focus on more than any other that will make a difference in terms of locking down our food security in the months and years ahead?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Food security has definitely completely been thrown in the spotlight since the Ukraine war. But I think the main kind of take-home message I would say from this is that it's important to really look at the whole picture of what's going on, and not rush to say we need to up production, we need to do this X, Y, and Z. You know, I think we need to actually look at all of the factors of what's going on to really get to the heart of the problem. I think it's crucial to keep one eye now and one eye in the future. So in short-term food security, absolutely crucial, especially looking at, you know, the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable countries, ensuring that now, but also not to lose sight of the future and where we're going, and to ensure that we can have a viable food supply also in the future, because that's also the point. And I think, you know, keeping in mind this idea that there's not actually this risk of food security in the EU, but there is a very real threat of food prices. So I think refocusing back on that, thinking about how EU countries can use the tools at their disposal to help safeguard consumers, to help safeguard the most vulnerable people, you know, the poorest consumers that we have. It has to be a concerted effort, and I think that would be my main take-home message.
Pauline, from your perspective, what do you think is the key thing we have to keep our eye on at this stage to ensure our food security going forward?
Well, just to put everything a bit in perspective, I think there's really one blessing in disguise that I see out of this this crisis that the Ukraine war has really prompted, like an increase. It has put on the table questions of food security and energy security. And for the last decades, some people have been waving flags and shouting at the needs to take into account the limits of the planet. And, you know, in countries like Europe, we never felt that there is actually challenges in terms of sustainability or of food or energy security. And this year, it's the first time that we're actually asking consumers, or consumers everywhere are going to realize that energy, of food, or just basic staples, are, you know, commodities that can not always be available or not always at very cheap price. And so I think that at every level we have to take this moment of crisis to just try to understand the big challenges ahead, and to try to rethink the way like consumers consume, and policymakers, you know, it's a really good opportunity to have to push for a very ambitious agenda on transitioning.
Thanks very much, Pauline. Tom, what is your, I suppose, key take home or key overriding sentiment in terms of where we need to take this food security debate and where our ultimate priority must lie?
Well, I very much agree with what Pauline has just said. I think the current crisis has brought home into very sharp relief that we are dealing with food and energy security, and there's a lot of the politics of the outcome of this crisis is leading us in this direction anyway. I go back to reiterate my point that we shouldn't be talking only about food security. We need to talk of food and nutrition security and understand what that means. And then finally, that the issue of sustainable food systems has to be at the heart of policy. And it's not just, we're not just talking about agricultural policy, we're talking about a policy for society. And for that to happen, it's not something that gets handed down from the top. It's not handed down from government. It's something that everybody at all levels of the supply chain, from farmers to consumers to retailers, to everyone has a part to play in this. And we really have to work together to take this more seriously and deliver on it.
Thank you very much. And I think with that, we'll probably conclude. I think the point that I suppose food production, nutrition and sustainability are part of our, if you like, are intrinsical to our long-term future. And I think how we get whole of society to have that conversation and to have it in the context of, let's say, where we are challenged by a growing population, we are challenged by limited water supply, and we are challenged by the limited energy sources to give us the fertilizer, to produce the food. We find ourselves with perhaps more constraints than we have recognized in the last 10 to 20 years. And I think it's time perhaps we reevaluate and realign our priorities where we have quite simply limited resources and perhaps have not been careful enough about how we use them. And I think that's probably something we need to reflect on generally going forward. It just remains for me to say, just to thank our 4 panelists. I really appreciate the time you've taken. We've been here for over an hour and a half. I'd like to thank all the people who logged online. I think we had just around 100 there at the height of it there. It's tripped off a little bit more in the last 15 minutes or so. But and thank for the engagement and the questions. And I suppose it is a debate that will rumble, and it's something that we need certainly to keep a focus on in the months and years ahead. Just perhaps that debate will continue next Saturday. I know Fine Gael are organising an agricultural conference on Saturday in Tullamore. Anybody is welcome to join. I think it's from a Fine Gael perspective, it's very much about looking at our ag policy going forward and our different priorities, agriculture and rural development piece. So we'd encourage anyone who's interested to come along and add to the conversation and help formulate Fine Gael policy in terms of where we're going and what we're trying to achieve in terms of agriculture in the months and years ahead. So that's in Tullamore, in the Tullamore Court Hotel this coming Saturday. I start kicking off at 11 o'clock. You can register on the Fine Gael website as well to if you're interested in joining along. But I'd like to yet again thank the panelists, and no doubt we will pick this debate up further and look forward to being part of discussions where we try to, if you like, manage and secure our food supply into the future, because there are very few things that people are dependent on more than food. And I think if you look at the if you like, the EU as a model, one of the founding things that it was built on was the need to secure a food supply for Europe after a half a century of wars and food insecurity. And that has worked so well for 50 years, it's perhaps left us where we are today in terms of or have been up until now in terms of, if you like, a belief that food security wasn't an issue anymore. But with our climate challenges, with our energy constraints, and with our geopolitical current situation, it's very clear that this continues to be an issue. It's something we have to focus on the years ahead. So thanks again to my panel, and thanks to everyone for engaging, and look forward to chatting to you again soon.